Diagwit, welcome to Tales from the Land, a living community research project where we at the Green Step are inquiring into the 21st century realities of food production, farming and living well with the land here in Ireland.
I'm Mel.
And I'm John.
And we're your hosts.
In these podcasts and online events, we will use the arts of conversation and storytelling to listen, learn and create new understandings of one another and the multitude of approaches being used to engage with the complexities of the climate and biodiversity crisis. As we go, we'd love to hear from you about your experiences, struggles, ideas and visions for a sustainable, prosperous and just future for all. Please send your ideas to thegreenstep3@gmail.com and we'll include what emerges as we engage with the policy consultations of land use in Ireland. Our ancestral practices of tending to the land are rooted in our Irish culture, heritage and language. How can we weave these ancient wisdoms together with modern solutions for sustainability? We'll meet with you and a variety of folk to explore this question and more. Together we intend to listen and learn from the tales of the land and see where the journey takes us.
Diagwit McCarty, and welcome to Tales from the Land. This is episode 3, and I hope you're keeping well as you arrive here in what has been a fiery week, I think. Bealtaine opened us up to the summer on May 1st and the Fire Festival here in Ireland. And I know for me, I've really been feeling the fiery energy move through me in challenging and beautiful ways, burning away what doesn't serve and really welcoming in that which does, and allowing for this kind of energy of the phoenix rising from the ashes into something new. And I feel like that's what we're doing here with this project as well, with Tales from the Land, where so far in the discussions, things have really been called out, you know, in the systems and in the systems at play in our food systems. We're naming what isn't working for us as citizens of this island, you know, as humans of this earth. We're saying this is not right anymore and it needs to change. And of course, we're not the first people doing that. I'm not naive. Of course, there's been many people calling this out. But of course, the more of us that call it out, the more we come together, the more powerful, the more clearly our voices can be heard. And so this week we are leaning into that sense of burning away the old, burning away what doesn't serve us. And we're going to be talking about the global systems of capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, white privilege, and how that all underpins the European system that we here in Ireland benefit from. Now, as I say that, I need to be very clear with you, dear listener, wherever you are and whoever you are. This is big, weighty stuff. As you listen, you will probably feel uncomfortable. Some of your values and beliefs might be challenged. And whenever we or I approach a topic like this, I really suggest that, you know, self-care is key. If you're feeling particularly tired or emotional or exhausted today, you know, and you've had a busy week, and maybe it isn't the time to listen to this today. And yet maybe if you're feeling curious, perhaps you already know a little bit about these topics and you want to know more and you've already touched in. If you're willing to be questioned and challenged and be here with an open heart with us in what is a challenging conversation, then thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. I really appreciate you. We really appreciate you. And your listening here is really an act of solidarity with oppressed peoples around the world who have been continually abused and subjected to enormous violences by these massive global systems. And today, that's what we want to dive into. So be aware that in this episode, we will talk about violence, atrocities, really heartbreaking things. And if you choose to listen, the request is that you be here with an open heart and let yourself feel the heartbreak that is there in this system. Because I know for me, feeling that heartbreak and letting myself have an open heart is what fuels me, and it fuels my work. And the meaning of to be compassionate is to suffer with. And of course, the more of us who are willing to face these atrocities and really lean in and feel these wounds that are in our collective being here on Earth, in our collective human systems and how we relate to the Earth, our food systems, our land use, extractive practices like mining, and how we relate to countries around the world, from us here in the global North to other countries in the global South. All of the geopolitical complexity that comes with that. It's a lot to unpack, and it can be easy. It is so much easier to just let yourself be ignorant. But if you're here and you're still listening and you're feeling ready, then thank you for being with us and for taking the plunge. In this episode, myself and John are joined by Fiachra Keogh, who has been a wonderful, wonderful ally in this Tales of the Land project. He has put so much time and effort into listening to us, into helping us idea share and map out how this project can come about. So though he isn't, a third co-host on what would then be a very busy podcast, we're really happy to have him here. Fiachra and I did a communications event back in December. Thank you to Development Perspectives for funding that. And you'll hear more from Fiachra shortly. He's studying a master's in sustainable development at the moment, and is, I think, most happiest in his role as father and husband, and has lived in Mexico for years too, and is very aware of the colonial systems and the issues around multinational corporations and their presence here in Ireland as a tax haven. So we'll hear more from him later. We also have Jenn Matchain joining us. I met Jenn first at a zero waste educator training back in, I'd say we're going back 6 years here, maybe a bit longer, maybe 5 years. Yeah. And Jenn is doing a Ph.D. and really, really is very aware of colonialism and the violences that it causes. Her key area of focus is conflict and violence. And she is a wizard at calling out these systems and what they do. She's a Mexican woman, and so, has a very intimate understanding of the way that these systems affect countries outside of the global North. And we're also joined today by Jimmy from Tuiscint na Talún, Jimmy Billings. And Jimmy is a wonderful education promoter. He has studied an awful lot around colonialism and its effects in an Irish context, especially with how we relate to the land, which is key here, I think, as we talk about food systems. And again, you'll hear more from each of our lovely guests later on, and their projects and areas of interest. So I'm really welcoming them and welcoming you, and really inviting you to make sure that your self-care today is good. So maybe you need to sit in the garden, take a walk, talk with some friends, reach out to us. The Green Step community on Facebook is a very active and beautiful place where you can bring your questions and insights as you listen. Conversations are so welcome there, where we can learn and grow together. You'll find that on Facebook, thegreenstepcommunity.com. And if you don't want to go on Facebook, you're not a Facebook user, that's okay. You can find our website, thegreenstep.org, and you'll be able to contact myself that way if you need a little bit of extra support or want to reach out about these topics. We would love to hear your contributions. We would really love to hear your thoughts, your ideas on how we can engage with these complex systems. And maybe also hear how, this episode perhaps challenges some of your beliefs. So definitely suggesting to be clear on your self-care for today. What do you need to feel good today? and thank you very much for being here. So we're gonna dive in, and I'm gonna pour us a cup of tea and we'll get going. Gurb míle magat. Welcome everybody to episode 3 of Tales from the Land, our communal research project. I am one of your hosts, Mel. John is also here, and we're joined by Fiachra, Jimmy and Jenn. And today we're going to talk about decoloniality and its relevance in an Irish context. Now, this is a very nuanced topic of conversation, so my feeling is we're going to leave this with more questions than when we arrived. But that's okay. And we're going to be putting this in conversation with the food system. And we're doing this at the start of our exploration because we want to name the systems first. That's really important, to get clear on the systems that we're trying to engage with and change as we engage with policy, as we engage with people in our communities. Because when we can understand those deeper workings, we can actually have maybe a clearer place to actually move forward from. So this is big work, and it's quite new here in Ireland. So we're going to do our best to share it. But first, I would love to ask people to share where they are and who they are, and the landscapes that they are in. So yeah, I might pass over to Jenn first.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me and for the invitation. My name is Jenn Matchain. I am currently a researcher and a Ph.D. candidate in Trinity College, Dublin. I'm doing research focused on conflict and violence, mainly violent conflict and structural violence. I am using a decolonial feminist lens, and my current topic of research for my PhD thesis is permaculture and Western peace intervention. I explore different aspects of coloniality, racism, emancipation movements, environmental justice, and food sovereignty. I am originally from Mexico, and I left Mexico about 13 years ago, and I've lived since in 7 different countries. So yeah, I think that's me. Yeah.
Gorgeous. You're very welcome. And if anyone is listening and is like, oh my God, what were those words? Don't worry, we're going to get into all of that. Yeah. And Jenn, do you want to just tell us where you are in the island of Ireland at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I've been living in Ireland for 5 years, and I am currently in County Kildare, in the countryside. Yeah.
Gorgeous. Is there any tree or bush looking out the window at you? Looking in the window?
Yeah, actually there's a couple of weeping trees and many bushes outside. I'm living in my husband's family house at the moment, and so yeah, so it's really nice outside. Yeah.
Gorgeous. Thank you. We're welcoming that in.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I might pass over to Fiachra now. He's gazing out his window at his environment.
Thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone. My name is Fiachra Keogh. I'm a student of sustainable development in UCD, and I have a background in cultural colonialism from National University of Ireland, Galway. Strangely enough, I'm married to a Mexican from the same city that Jenn's from, but that's just a happy coincidence. Yeah, I'm based in Cavan, in the centre north of Ireland for people outside the country. And beside us, we just came back from a trip to the Claddagh Glen, which is behind the Marble Arch Caves. It's a geopark straddling Fermanagh and County Cavan, and there's a beautiful river walk. And at this time of year, it's just gorgeous. Lots of butterflies and dragonflies and the babbling brook. You can really hear it babbling. I understand what they mean when they say babbling now. So that's where I am. I have a big interest in reclaiming the commons and protecting, restoring and protecting our natural heritage. I believe it belongs to all of us. So thank you for having me.
Gorgeous. Welcoming in that babbling brook. I can hear it as you say it. It's gorgeous. Thank you for being here. And yeah, I might pass over to John. People know John already, but you might say your place in this context, in this discussion.
Things. I'm John, your other co-host. I'm currently here in Cove, looking out my window at a nice ash tree that has a few crows nesting in it, which are incredibly loud, but I find them incredibly beautiful because they're just too smart for their own good. So I'm an ecologist. I'm the campaigns manager for Carbon Nature Network, and I'm also on the board of SWAN, so that's the Sustainable Waters Network Ireland, a group of NGOs dealing with water issues in Ireland and the Water Framework Directive. But today I'm speaking as myself, and that is the hat I currently have on, my own. So gorgeous. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, John. Gurmila. And Jimmy, you're very welcome. Will you tell us whereabouts you are and who you are?
Hi Mel, thanks for having me on. I'm Jimmy and I'm currently living in Dublin, though I'm from Waterford. And my nearest nice place other than pavement is St. Anne's Park and Bull Island. So I'm fortunate. There's also a forest in Hove quite nearby, so I'm fortunate to have those green spaces near me in the middle of the city. And there's also a fairy tree actually on my road, which is worth mentioning. So I run a project called Tuiscint na Talún, from the Irish, and it can loosely translate as wisdom of the land, which refers not to the wisdom we hold of the land, but the wisdom that the land herself holds. So it's a call or philosophy, if you like, for us to listen to what the land has to offer us, what the land can teach us as we are part of the land. So it's also about listening to ourselves too, but coming down from the pedestal, I suppose, that we put ourselves on as separate from this thing we like to call nature. So the aim of my project then is to sort of teach and engage people with the philosophies around our disconnection and estrangement from what we call nature, and how we can reconnect to that through our ancestral knowledges, which were more embedded in the land and respectful of the land. I'm also an associate researcher with the master's program in race, migration and decolonial studies in University College Dublin, and my broad research interests are in decolonization, anti-colonialism, racial justice, knowledge justice, and sensorial engagement with the land and social change. So that is me.
Very powerful. Packs a punch. Thank you. I feel like just there, as you name the wisdom embedded in the old Irish cultures, I have here beside me Mangan's new book, 32 Words for Field. And I just want to read out some of those 32 words for field. So we've got, and excuse my pronunciation, this could be painful for any Gael goers there, but I'd say most people are like me and don't know it either, so I'll do my best. So Giavhar is a field of corn grass. Biorak is a marshy field. Brannar is a fallow field. Clun is a meadow field between two woods. Plas is a level field for spreading flax or hay. Plas Sog is a sheltered field in which a mare would foal. Bool is a field for keeping cattle before milking. And Leopold is a neat but well-arranged field and is similar to Colonial, which is also neat but smaller. So that's just an example of what Jimmy's naming there. I think, the wisdom embedded in the Irish language, and because the Irish language is an indigenous language to these lands, which has largely been wiped out here in Ireland. But so as we're engaging with this topic, I want to just name first that we're looking at the European food system and how we can engage with it, with the common agri-food policy, the CAP policy, which we're bringing, what emerges from these discussions. But we can't engage with that system without first acknowledging that it is a racist system. It's rooted in racism and colonialism. And I think that's hard for a lot of us to hear. And part of this conversation is just to help us engage with that a little bit more. And yeah, there's this common thing that's kind of said a lot in Ireland, which I want to just name straight away, that there's often said, if people say, we're also racist in Ireland because we are white and we benefit from the white privilege of being part of the European Union, that they say, well, in England, they used to have those signs that would say, no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs. So we were equally oppressed. So why is that a relevant conversation to us? But I think a lot of this conversation is going to be us explaining why it is a relevant conversation, particularly in relation to our food system and how we relate to the land. As Vandana Shiva, who is an activist for food sovereignty, says so beautifully, food is sacred. And I think we've forgotten that in a lot of cases. And I hope this discussion will kind of touch a little bit onto that. So yeah, John, did you want to come in there on something?
No, it's more, as we have pointed out, I think it's often good to speak more about it. I would ask Jimmy or Jen, would you mind speaking about how our food system is rooted in racism? Because I think it's often good to have an explanation of a topic that big when it's just thrown out there.
Yeah, thank you. Jimmy's pointing to Jen there to take this one.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, we need to sort of approach a bit of the main questions that were for this podcast. And the first one is what is decoloniality, and why? Well, the question kind of why is relevant to consider to reconsider our food systems, right? So I would say that decoloniality is not one thing; it's many things. It's a school of thought, an intellectual tradition within critical theories. It's a political framework to help articulate historical lived experiences of oppressed groups, which are mostly people of color. And it's a praxis or a practice of resistance in opposition to what we call hegemonic Western project of civilization. So in Spanish, that would be el proyecto civilizatorio. So this is obviously not an all-encompassing definition whatsoever, but it sets the tone. So based on that, the current expressions of colonization, or the most obvious, are capitalism, currently in its neoliberal form, and globalization. So if we understand colonization, and we can then explain racism, but first I think it's important to explain colonization and neo-colonization in essence as a project of power, right? So I think there are many things that can be said about it, but it's important to mention that, yeah, ethnic violence has existed in history across various different groups and cultures. And this is acknowledged by decolonial approaches as well. I would disagree with the approach that says that violence is a feature of humanity and of history. I would say that violence is rather a feature of the oldest system of oppression in which all the other systems sprout from, and that is patriarchy, right? So once we name those systems, we can then name the systems that come from those sort of overarching systems, right? What I would say is the difference between European violence, which later became white supremacist violence, and we can also call it whiteness, is the levels of violence, the extent of that violence, the systemic use of that violence, and the frameworks, one of which is racism, that violence used in order to give origin to new forms of violence. So, and many of those types of violence are invisibilized or made invisible by normalizing it within the past 500 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think decolonization really is a thought tradition or a framework. It has its origins in Latin American intellectual tradition, and within indigenous groups as well. At least it is where it was articulated more explicitly first, but as with all knowledge, different expressions of decoloniality have been manifested all across the global south and diasporic groups of people of color. And this is not a coincidence, right? That this sort of approaches come from the people of color, because this is the people that have experienced different types of oppression and different levels of oppression. So I would say that, more than decoloniality being relevant in a way to reconsider our food systems, right? I would say that a decolonial approach, it seeks to challenge the systems within which food is currently being produced, right? So rather than inserting decoloniality to either modify or rethink particular aspects of the system, decoloniality aim is to dismantle the entirety of that system or those systems. This is important because coloniality's first practice was really the separation. The first form of separation was from humans to nature, right? And then it sort of evolved into a separation of our thought processes, in which we think, we think that we have to fix certain parts or sections, or reframe certain parts of the system, rather than dismantling current systems and then creating new structures.
Yeah.
So that separation really serves coloniality.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenn.
Yeah.
As I'm listening to you, I'm wondering if I might ask Jimmy to kind of come in there. I know he talks a lot about knowledge, justice, and the kind of how coloniality doesn't exist without modernity. And I'm wondering if he might just speak to that a little bit, just to kind of develop on what you've said so beautifully there, Jenn. I think it can highlight the violences that are at the root of that.
Sure. I mean, I can just maybe add to what Jenn has been saying, since many of these concepts are going to be quite new to most listeners, I imagine. So modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality are three kind of codependent concepts in a joint framework, which was initially articulated by, as Jenn said, by Indigenous peoples, and later then Indigenous scholars as they made their way into the academy, and by many other scholars then working within decolonial frameworks around the globe. And I guess the idea is that modernity / coloniality, because they're constituent of each other, they have been the unmaking of us as human beings by trapping us in a short-sighted existence where everything in our societies exists solely for human-centered ends. Mm-hmm. And those human-centered ends have been themselves been shaped by modernity, which is, as Jenn said, the project of Western civilization and enabled through coloniality. So using the term modernity, coloniality, is a way to reveal the mutual constituency of modernity and coloniality. So in decolonial scholarship, it's expressed in this way to always point to the fact that coloniality is the necessary underside of modernity. Like, one does not exist without the other. There is no Western civilization without enslavement. There is no supermarket without the destruction of land for monoculture plantations. There is no modern Ireland as we know it without the virtual absence of our language, the flattening of our forests for grass fields, and the extinction of many other beings, and so on. The self-aggrandizement of Western modernity is contingent on the processes and histories of slavery, land theft, land destruction, genocide, and cultural imperialism, among other things. Yeah. The concept coloniality itself was coined by the Peruvian sociologist, I'll probably butcher the pronunciation of his name, but Aníbal Quijano. And he says that coloniality diagnoses the broad condition of colonialism that is not just operating on a political and economic level, but on an epistemic or knowledge system level. So it calls into question the idea that knowledge is disembodied and independent of any specific geohistorical locations. Because when we talk about colonialism, right, there's this, people have a picture of the European conquest of the Americas or the European colonization of Africa. But coloniality kind of goes beyond that, and it talks about how physical colonialism left a legacy that is far beyond just the effects on economic or political systems, right? That it goes into gender, sexuality, spirituality, social organization, into our minds, so that it's a system of total domination. Colonialism is a system of total domination of human beings and land and everything. So then decoloniality acknowledges that there is no one true way of knowing, doing, or living life, which is in direct contradiction to Eurocentric or Western ways of knowing, doing, and living, which have been forcibly exported to the rest of the world and fashioned as universal truth. Western knowledge is not just ethnocentric in that it emanates from the imperial centers of the global north, but it's also human-centric in that it has no regard for the life and knowledge of the more than human living world, which is what my project is focused on, right?
Yeah, beautifully said.
The living world is sort of seen as expendable or as a resource. And just to name as well, that decoloniality is a global movement. You know, it's not limited to the academy, and its enunciations are not just academic, but that this language is sort of necessary to name like a very complex oppressive system.
Yeah, I really hear you. Yeah.
Just to finish on that, it's really important to name as well that decoloniality as a concept and as a movement, it's not seeking to be another universal to displace Western modernity as the universal system, but as it's an effort to relocalize and pluralize knowledge. And that's going to look different in every place that's struggling against colonialism and colonial ways of being. Yeah.
What I'm really here, yeah, thank you for that. And I think why it's really important talking about it in this environmental context in Ireland is that it's about climate justice. And we say that a lot, you know, it's this kind of buzzword in activism, climate justice. It's BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of colour on the front lines of climate change. That's who we need to be standing with. And that's kind of just said again and again and again. But the thing is, are we really listening to them? And I think the important thing there is that we're listening, and that the approaches that are emerging and that have been emerging, that have always been there, but that are, you know, becoming louder when we listen, is this decolonial approach and this pluralistic or complex, multiplicable, that's not even a word, but way of looking at things. And that's kind of, we're going back to the complexity of nature rather than looking at this kind of simplified system of there's just one way. There's one thing that Jimmy highlighted to me as we were talking, that, instead of saying knowledge, to say knowledges, because when we say knowledge, we're assuming that there's one knowledge system that we're kind of referring to, which is typically that colonial, Western, global North system. And to actually say it knowledges, honors the multiple different perspectives of life and research. And I might just pass over to Fiachra there, if he wants to come in.
Thanks, Mel, and thanks, Jimmy and Jen. It's really interesting. I'm learning a lot. Just a little story about how colonialism has entrenched itself into the psyche of people in my wife's village. So my wife is from a little mining, it's an ex-mining village up the mountains in Jalisco beside Magdalena. Jen would know the area. And when I was there, I was looking at a photo on the wall of her house, and it showed my wife when she was about 5. She had covered herself in white cream. she had broken into her mum's bedroom and taken this jar of cream and covered herself in cream. And when she was asked why did she do it, she said that she wanted to be a bonita baby. She wanted to be bonita because if you were white, you were bonita, you were beautiful. And I noticed driving up the Lopez Mateo in Guadalajara that all the billboards have white supermodels. They don't. It's that deep in the psyche. People want to be white. They associate white with progress. They associate it with success in life. They associate dark and indigenous with poverty and ignorance. And it's become so ingrained into the psyche that it becomes a very tricky and difficult thing to untangle yourself from. So, yeah, I mean, that story came to mind when you guys were talking. So thank you.
Thank you, Fiachra, for that. And thank you, Jimmy and Jen. I'd just like to say for people who are listening, and this is all new to them, and you've never heard this before, it's all new to me too. Majority of what I've heard today, it's the first time I'm hearing. And so just keeping an open heart and an open ears to it, because it is difficult and it's confusing, but it is an incredibly important topic to get across.
Yeah.
And so, yes.
Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate your saying. I have a story I'd like to share, but I'm seeing Fiachra and Jen there wanting to come in, so I might share that after. But just to contextualize what we're talking about a bit, Jen, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just so that you wouldn't miss that part of, like, I think maybe a lot of Irish people want to really understand more clearly why we're considering Ireland as being part of the colonial project. And I think there are many ways in which we can express this more directly, so that we, as you say, we give a little bit of context. So historically, individual Irish people and diasporic Irish were involved directly in slavery. And a lot of the resources of that, of the slave trade, particularly in the Caribbean and in sugar plantations, ended up, that wealth was, ended up in Ireland and is still currently in Ireland. There was also, in terms of environmental racism, for example, and there are many ways, right? But I'm just going to sort of mention a few in terms of where the trash produced by, the trash produced in Ireland ends up many times in countries in the global south. A lot of the production that comes from, the sort of corporate production, it's made with the labor and resources from the global south as well.
And could I just jump in there for 1 second,
sure.
Say more on the recycling side of things.
Sure.
In the last 2 years, you may have noticed that we no longer recycle soft plastic.
Mm-hmm.
That is not because we're not able to do it. It's eminently possible, just more difficult. The thing is that China was the one taking 90% of all plastic from Europe and North America. China has decided to stop that. So that is why we no longer recycle soft plastic. That's now is being sent to landfills, and generally those landfills do end up in the Philippines and Indonesia. And it's one of the things to think about as well. There's two arguments in this. You'll always hear that the majority of plastic in the sea comes from the global south and from Indonesia. It does, because that plastic was shipped there from the north. Whereas then when you look at carbon, and the amount of carbon that is produced, it is much more produced in the Northern Hemisphere than in the South. So that's just something to put in context, but please continue, Jen.
So as you said, about the plastic being exported, and also in terms of, what I call the good intentions industry, which I don't know if it exists already, that term, but I use it, which means, this whole industry about global development, aid, charity, peacekeeping, etc. The other one would be through the financial and trade system. Ireland, as a tax haven, in which Ireland participates, in the accumulation of wealth that is mostly produced in the global south. For that, if anyone needs sources and studies I can obviously provide if you're interested in digging more deeply into it.
Yeah, we can include that in the links of the description. Thank you, Jenn.
Yeah, so that's it. just a few examples,
Yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you. Fiachra?
Yeah, thanks, Jenn. That's really important information, I think, especially to do with the tax haven status that we have. And that's not a victimless crime at all.
No.
But I wonder, do our listeners know what colonialism and neocolonialism, and how did we get to this position? I understand that Ireland has a very complicated position because we were colonized, but now as our status as in a developed world tax haven, how we are functioning, how people are suffering as a result of our food systems. How did we get here? And one country I studied not in my college, but from working with refugees from there, was the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think it serves as a really good example of traditional colonialism. So King Leopold of Belgium, he declared the Congo was his. He wanted a colony. All the others had colonies, and he wanted one too. So he used an explorer called Henry Morton Stanley to trick the natives with mirrors and gin, and got them to sign over their lands in return for glass beads and alcohol. Now, the natives had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know that somebody putting a pen in their hand and making a mark on a piece of paper meant that they no longer had access to the fish and the trees, and it was literally that cynical. They tricked the natives into handing over their land and then forced it with guns. So they appropriated this huge area of land in Central Africa. And an Irishman called Roger Casement, he's from Antrim. Casement Park is named after him in Dublin. So he was working as British consul, and he saw what was happening in the Congo, that the Belgians under King Leopold had enslaved the locals to harvest rubber. So at the time, the car wheel had been invented, and the Goodyear factory was looking for rubber. So Congo had a lot of rubber. So the Belgian army and a lot of mercenary soldiers were used to subjugate the people who were given rubber quotas. They had to go out and get rubber from the forest, and they enslaved a whole nation of people. Now, it wasn't just that they enslaved them, but they drew an artificial line in Africa, and this is something that isn't spoken about that much. But you had tribes like the Hutu and the Tutsis, who later on had this war in Rwanda. But Rwanda wasn't a country until the Europeans drew that line, right? It wasn't, so that you have these ethnic groups forced together, and power is given to one group, and when they withdraw, the other group rose up against them. But back to the Congo, when King Leopold, Roger Casement started a public campaign to get the international eyes on what was happening there, and eventually he sold it to the Belgian government. But nothing changed for the people, because the Belgian government continued taking the resources like King Leopold had been doing. In 1968, Patrice Lumumba was elected the first democratically elected prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the UK and the United States, who had been used to getting their resources from the Congo, which was full of gold, silver, diamonds, uranium, so much stuff that they were using for their military. They said, no, we want to keep getting our stuff from there. And Lumumba said, the resources of the Congo will be for the Congolese. So the United Kingdom, Belgium, France, United States with the help of the United Nations, which is the most shameful thing, they organized his assassination. And they replaced him with a dictator called Mobutu and returned to business as usual, meaning access to resources. So I see colonialism, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism and racist food systems. What's really at the core of it is access to resources. And people want to, who are used to getting access to resources in the global south, they don't want that interfered with because they're extracting wealth. So I think the Congo is a really good example, and I'll put a link in the description as well for people. There's a really good movie about that called King Leopold's Ghost.
Thank you for that, Fiachra. John?
Fiachra, if I may just add to that, I remember actually in secondary school that was our comparative, was the Congo, what happened there in the Secession of Katanga. So that was the part of the Congo that separated off, and they were actually the ones in the end who killed Lumumba. I won't describe how it happened because it is horrific and it will haunt you. But one of the first thing I'd like to mention is that how it was found out that he was murdered was it was the ex-head of the Belgian Secret Service, I believe it was in the early 80s or 90s, told the anecdote of how he was killed on a Belgian TV talk show, basically the same as a Late Late Show. And how he was murdered was greeted by laughter. It was kind of like a funny anecdote from the past. So that's one thing. It's heinous. Yeah. The other point is that what happened in the Congo, I believe, is one of the most brutal colonialization things that has ever happened. To the point where people would, if you didn't get your rubber quotas, you lost hands, so you'd get your hands cut off. Mothers would often cut off their own children's hands, or one of them, so they wouldn't work in the mines because they were so brutal. And they think millions of people died, and to put it in context, the sheer scale of the destruction. Think of all of Mania in Europe as one country. So all different. Think of all the different language. Think of Spanish, German, French, Italian, all of the many different languages. And now imagine within a generation, the language that is spoken most by the people in this entire area is Basque, a language that currently is spoken by about 1% of the European population. So that's how much destruction there was. That the most minor of minor languages becomes the most dominant language spoken. So I remember when I was told that example, I was like, oh dear Christ. That's
it really puts it into perspective. And I'm just feeling now that I just want to really honor our listeners, especially if this is a new subject, that this, it really is an intense thing to look into. And it's why I admire the work that Jimmy and Jenn both do with such courage. And as I think Jenn would say as well, doing this work in Ireland is a place of privilege, because, if you're doing this work around the world, you're really at risk of being murdered and being at the receiving end of that violence, which is not just a thing from the history books. It's still very much here. But I think I might just ground us a little bit with a story, if that's okay, just to bring it down a bit, and we can re-engage then with a little bit more about how this relates to our food system. But so I want to tell you the story about the fox and the hunter, which was gifted to me from Jimmy, and is a retelling of a story told by Martin Shaw. Now, I'm not sure if it's his story or not. I'd say it's an ancient old story. But so I'd like to take you to the mystical forest that we find in most of our fairy tales, that place in our psyche. And if you feel like, taking a few deep breaths and closing your eyes if it's safe, then please do. So there's this hunter, and I think in this context, the hunter can represent that colonial system a lot of the time and the attitudes held there. And the hunter is used to living on his own. He has his mud hut in the forest, and he spends his days out on the land, tracking and seeking and hunting and listening to the land and hunting for food. And he arrives home one day, and there's smoke coming from his hut, and he's a little bit concerned about this. This is all his worldly possessions. And he goes to the window and peers in, and he notices that the smoke is actually from food being cooked on the stove for him. And his clothes, his raggedy pile of clothes, has been folded neatly and mended. And this kind of shocks his system because he's never received this type of care before. And he goes in and, has a sniff around and eventually realizes nobody else is here, and he sits down and eats this nourishing meal. And yeah, his soul is something that's really touched. And this goes on for a week, and he comes home. And as Martin says in his story when he's telling it, if it was you, you'd probably do this sooner than he did. But eventually at the end of the week, he decides to come home a bit early, and he peeks in the window, and he can see the food being cooked on the stove by this radiant being. There's this flame of red hair running down the back of her body. And he's peeking in, and as any woman knows when she's being watched, she knows she's being watched, and she turns around and she says very firmly and clearly, "I will be the woman of this hut." And he looks around and, yeah, okay, you will be. And so this woman is the fox woman dreaming. She's part fox, part wilderness. She's part woman, part human. And the dreaming, the mystical realm, all wrapped up in this one beautiful being. And that night, they sit at the table and meet and talk and share and sing songs and have one of those nights that, we'd all be so jealous of, those intimate, beautiful moments. And we all wish we could be there for. And the seedling of love begins to sprout between these people. And as she sits in the house, she's taken her coat, her fur, off her and hangs it on the door. And she begins to make herself at home, caring for him, nurturing him, and making this house a home. He's very, very grateful. And this goes on and their love grows. But there's just this one thing that's bothering him. And it's the pelt. He's a hunter, and he has been trained to know the smell of the pelt, to hunt down this scent in an animal. And now it's filling up his home. It's in the furniture. It's in the bedclothes. It's everywhere. And he sits down one night and says, "Oh, my lovely, my dearest woman, you've made my life so much better. There's just this one thing. It's just the cloak. Could you get rid of the pelt? Could you maybe hang it on a tree or put it outside? It's just a bit much." And she doesn't say anything and says maybe he's just having a moment. And she leaves it at that. And it goes on, and he's getting more and more worked up. This smell of the fur filling his nostrils night after night, and he's just beginning to go a bit stir crazy. And one night, all his niceties leave him, and he says, "The pelt needs to go." And the next morning, he wakes up, and the pelt is gone, and the fox woman dreaming is gone. And day after day and night after night, he stands at his door and waits with this sense of loss and longing. But she is gone, and she does not return. And his clothes get raggedy, and his house gets unloved, and he returns to the way he lived once more. And that is what we've done to our food system, to our way of living. We have banished the wild. We've banished the wild fox woman. And this is our opportunity to welcome her back, if we're brave enough to do so. So yeah, thank you, Jimmy, for sharing that story.
This is Mel interjecting with a little bit of info on how you can really support Indigenous peoples around the world. So many of these people have relied on having people come to them to learn and exchange knowledge. And with coronavirus, of course, that's stopped. So there's many communities who've relied on this kind of type of tourism to make their income, to be able to trade in markets and in ways that they need beyond their own self-sufficiency. So I am currently donating to a crowd called Yawanawa. It's a group of Indigenous peoples. It's a collective of 8 villages based in Brazil. So we've got Amparo, Escondido, Yawanari, Matrina, Mawa, Uxi, Mutu, Sete Estrella, and Tibucuso. I've probably not said them right, but you get the gist. It's a collective of Indigenous communities in the Amazon, and the Amazon is so close to my heart. What an amazing, amazing ecosystem. And so I am donating to them to support them in this time of crisis. So I'm going to leave the link for that community up on our episodic digest for this episode on the website, www.thegreenstep.org. If you want, you can donate there. And if not, maybe you can find another organization you can donate to, or perhaps you can share this podcast, or maybe have this conversation with somebody in your life, or do some reading. Fiachra, Jimmy, and Jen have all provided some references and resources for us to dig a little bit deeper and take a deeper dive into these subjects. So if there's something here that has particularly tweaked your interest, again, I encourage you to go to the episodic summary on our website where you can find out more. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with this beautiful song called Wild Spirit, which has been dedicated to the Green Step community by one of our members, Marion Horgan, who wrote and composed this gorgeous song. It speaks about the wildness of life, and that's exactly what we're trying to cultivate again as we name these systems of coloniality and how they've affected us. That story of the fox and how we've ostracized the wild. We can bring it back by singing it, by speaking it, by weaving its magic back into our lives. And Marion's song does just that. So please enjoy these beautiful lyrics, and we'll be back with John, Jimmy, Fiachra, and Jen after this.
Spirit Wild. I'd like to dedicate this song to the spirit of this fantastic group and its founder, Melanie. Long may it prosper. Find the child inside of me, spirit wild, ancient voices, reconciled soul rejoices, serendipitous romance, in tune with nature's dance. Spirit wild, all-knowing, so inspired, ever growing, born of beauty, wild and strong, harmonizing nature's song. Spirit wild, bright and shining, ever restless, divining, it's a precious energy, an ageless gift for you and me. Spirit wild, all-seeing, undefiled, pure being, no boundaries, light and free, finds the child inside of me.
I'd love to welcome maybe a little bit of conversation around that sense of, we've kind of sanitized our food system, as Fiachra beautifully alluded to. Not beautifully, it's the wrong word, but very clearly named. There are so many links between our food system and how food is produced in this mechanized way with endless pesticides and fertilizers and chemicals, which is very connected to the war machine. A lot of those chemicals were actually developed around World War II. And after they stopped producing them for the war, they still wanted to keep this industry and this income stream going, and they channeled that into agriculture. And agriculture has gotten progressively more mechanized. There's a lot of talk, especially in the elite in America, of buying up land. And the way they want to deal with the land is to look at it like a machine, to spray it with chemicals, which causes so many illnesses in the people who live there, which destroys the ecosystem of the habitats. And that is maybe the shadow of the food system, because of course it's complex and it's not all that. But I do think that's a key thing that we need to be naming as we try to engage with this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anyone who feels like jumping in there. Fiachra has got his hand raised.
So thanks, Mel, and thanks for that story. It's just gorgeous. And so one of the issues I see is that our role as a tax haven, we allow companies to funnel profits here, and we allow companies to so countries functioning like we do allow transnational corporations to dodge their responsibility, and it means that they get a free pass on having a connection to the land where they do business. So for example, if they pollute a river in Mexico and the Mexican government say, okay, you can't do that, they say, okay, we'll move to Nicaragua, or we'll move. And so what we need to do is companies who have their headquarters here in Ireland, who are committing human rights abuses, who are extracting value, who are polluting, who are committing ecocide in wherever they're doing it, they need to be held accountable in this country. We shouldn't be harboring these corporations. Now, there's a debate about, well, you know, these corporations bring in a lot of money into Irish society, and that's true. Some money comes in from them, but this is going to be, this is you know, what we allow to happen. It's the coronavirus or climate change, or if we don't take care of what happens in one part of the world, it affects another part of the world. So one of my big goals is to see the end of Ireland functioning as a tax haven, because it's it allows these transnational corporations who don't have a soul, who don't have a responsibility, they don't have a connection to the land, they're allowed to get cheap labor, and they're allowed to extract for as much for as little as they to pay as little as they can, and they've gotten so entrenched into our food systems that the financial structure that allows them to funnel profits in a country like Ireland is what props them up. That's my take on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Fiachra, you did say one word that I'd just like you to explain: ecocide. What is ecocide for people who've never heard it before?
So ecocide, like the word homicide or genocide, is causing the death of. So it's causing the death of ecosystems. So, for example, our marine habitat has just been wiped out. Many marine habitats have been wiped out. In the last 30 years, we've seen a massive acceleration of exploitation of fish stock and bottom trawling, this process whereby these industrial debt factories, they drag nets with heavy weights along the bottom of the ocean, and they destroy the habitats and the ecosystems and everything that used to live in them. That's ecocide. So it's destroying an ecosystem, John.
Yeah, very
fantastic. Thank
clearly.
You.
Thank you. Yeah, Jimmy.
I just wanted to throw it back to some things that were being talked about earlier, and then I kind of wanted to lead into something else as well with that, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So I just wanted to kind of clarify from my own point of view the position that we find ourselves in Ireland with regards to race and whiteness and colonialism, where we're kind of caught, if you like, in Ireland between two worldviews, two cosmologies, two systems of knowledge and ways of being. And that's our own, if you like, indigenous, in inverted commas, worldview, and the Eurocentric worldview, of the white Eurocentric worldview, and that is the one that's dominant in our society. And these two worldviews are sort of incompatible with each other. Is the thing. There's constantly a rub between them, if you like. And that's like, when I say our Indigenous worldview, what I mean is the worldview that's contained in our language, that's contained in our land and in our ancestral knowledges that we lost to physical colonialism, but that we actually banished to oblivion ourselves, like through coloniality. So we actually in a way colonize ourselves by not allowing these things to exist in our society. So I just kind of wanted to name that, that, you know, we have been colonized, and we colonize ourselves, as I say, but Irish people also took part in the greater colonial project over the last 200 years.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not just how the modern state participates as a global North nation, but you know, lynching comes from an Irish surname. The only good Indian is a dead Indian was coined by an Irish man. Yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. Jenn has her hand raised there as well. We might go to Jenn.
Yeah, just to follow up with that, what Jimmy just said about, you know, being caught in two sort of worldviews and two systems. And I think this is where decoloniality comes into context for the Irish demographics, particularly the white demographics, right? I wouldn't necessarily think that decolonization is necessarily a framework that can be used by white demographics as such. I would say that it can be used in order to learn and understand the lived experiences of others. But because Ireland has had a history of basically siding with white supremacy, I think what needs to be done first, before recovering that indigenous knowledge, ancient knowledge within Ireland, and what needs to be done is a betrayal towards white supremacy. First of all, so yeah, learning from decoloniality as in listening to, but not as a continuation of epistemic extractivism, in which, you know, knowledge is extracted from, co-opted and appropriated from indigenous communities around the world, in which there is no exchange or asking for permission to use that knowledge or acknowledging where that knowledge comes from, and no retribution or reparations towards them. So I think that's a, you know, betrayal is not an easy task. It requires a lot of, it has an emotional cost, and it has obviously a renunciation of privilege, but it's also an exploration of trauma and pain and healing. Yeah. for whiteness. Yeah.
Very well named. I'll pass over to you, John. I just want to ask, or maybe just say that I totally agree that we need to have that betrayal of the system. But in my own experience, like in questioning my privilege, I had a really tough time with my mental health. And to be honest, if I didn't have, I really, really struggled. And I'm not saying I shouldn't have struggled, but I did really struggle. I went to a really low place, and a place I wasn't even sure I could actually come back from. I'm glad I did, because I had some vision of the future. But I think for me, in the kind of gift in our Irish roots, like our language, our culture, our landscapes, is like it can act as kind of a safety net, not a safety net, but it's a way for us to be held as we betray the system, as we question our privilege, because I think that's a very precarious position for someone to be in. And if someone thinks they must just step into betrayal without any sense of holding, that's really scary. And I think a lot of people just won't do the work then. So I think if we want people to do the work, I think that sense of they kind of go in tandem, question and betray the system, and also reclaim our language, reclaim our cultural practices, like our ancestral farming or ways of food preservation that are inherently, say, like fermenting food, like using a lot less plastic, growing with the seasons. Like there's a lot of gifts in this as well. And I just feel like they go hand in hand, rather than do this first and then reclaim it. But I really hear that in Ireland, we have such a gap in our knowledge that a lot of the time we refer to Indigenous culture around the world, especially like Latin America, and Peru. I know a lot of shamanic practitioners in Ireland kind of appropriate things from that, which feels very uncomfortable. But I think because it's been so lost here, sometimes we need to refer to other cultures that we were connected to in the ancient past to kind of learn and then figure out how does it engage in an Irish context. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm just adding in another kind of lens there from my own experience of just, and I think from everyone, you know, the struggle that's come through. Jimmy, I see your hand, and I know John wanted to come in, so maybe John, are you good? Yeah, Jimmy?
No, yeah, go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, I just wanted to bring it back to something Fiachra was saying again earlier. So Fiachra said that that he reckons the core of the Colonial project is about resources. But it's more, so this just to offer a bit more a different frame on that, maybe, that it's what white Europeans see as a resource where most cultures in the world don't relate to land in that way. So the crux of the issue actually becomes one of knowledge, how one worldview and one way of knowing was enforced violently over others. And it was knowledge, if you like, that made through Christianity first and then through secular science, that made the living world and other beings, more than human beings, into resources to be exploited. And kind of on that as well, I know that some of Jenn's work is on food systems. So maybe, since the podcast is about food as well, I want to ask Jenn maybe if she wants to talk about food sovereignty.
Sure. I think something that has to be mentioned. It's basically that the current food system, as we understand it, it's not really feeding the entire population. Not even feeding it. Food is seen as a commodity that serves the purpose of wealth accumulation. It's in some ways food is used to feed but not to nourish. Even those who are getting access to food are not being actually properly nourished. So, you know, that's what capitalism is designed for, right? To produce efficiently, but not for the people. Is at the end of the day is for the profit and for the accumulation of a particular sector of the population. So that's where food sovereignty comes from, right? The appropriation and the imposition as well of certain frameworks of working with the land. In what was historically indigenous land or territories. And those sort of agricultural frameworks were basically in terms of efficiency and of producing more of one single crop or two crops at a time, which requires an increasingly amount of inputs and of products also sold by the global north. In order to cultivate that land, and for which people who really cultivate it don't receive appropriate, sort of payment and retribution. So food sovereignty really is intellectual framework, but it's also a movement of autonomous food producers around the world, in which they reclaimed the production of food that for themselves, but also for their communities, and to do it in their own terms and within their own systems of knowledge of producing that food. There are many examples of this type of food sovereignty movements. There are cooperatives, autonomous schemes, food sharing, indigenous food foraging, etc. So that will be.
Yeah, thank you. You've said that really beautifully. I actually have a nice example here from an indigenous group of people in the Philippines. So it's the Bagabo Obi Monabo tribe, and I came across them. I was at a UN food system summit over the weekend, and Nancy Katamoko Katamko, is the first Filipino governor and who's from this tribe. So that's been a really big win for them. And they've implemented this, it's called LUPA, the Land Utilization Program for Sustainable Livelihoods in our Arancan. So what they've done is they've trained up 800 farmers, well, not trained up, but created space for 800 farmers to enhance their sustainable farming skills, which, you know, I think in Indigenous populations is often already there. It's about creating a space for that wisdom and knowing to emerge and be able to educate each other. It's increased household incomes by 30%. 640 hectares of farms that were previously monocrop farms, like just one crop, have now been converted to multi-crop farms. And there's 1 million agroforestry and forest tree seedlings that have been produced. So I think that's a really helpful example, because sometimes I think talking about engaging decoloniality with systems like the UN and food systems and agri-food policy sometimes maybe seems like it doesn't work. But but there are ways that these systems can kind of filter down funding that's needed to get these things off the ground. It's not to say it's perfect, but it is to say there are examples of this being put into practice, and that's just one. And there's also this from around the similar area with the Indigenous community of Bukidnon peoples, is a community conservation plan which is made by those people and for that land. So it's not someone else coming in. And that made me think of John and the work you're doing in North Cork. And I was wondering, like, does that feel relevant to bring in?
Well, from the context of food systems, not particularly. It's more about the protection of rivers and kind of getting local buy-in and really getting local people to again connect with the rivers and their natural environment, because I do believe that's the only way we will protect our natural environment, is that if we have an emotional connection to it, because without that we other it, and when we do that and by that I mean we feel disconnected from the natural environment. And it's only once we feel ownership around it, let's say ownership around our rivers and things like that, we feel as if we have a right and ability to work with it and to be with it.
I might just jump in there and say something that I learned again from this talk from that Governor Nancy who was speaking. She said one of the chiefs in her village says, we have to understand Indigenous ideas of ownership. And I'm just using this because you just said ownership, and I just think it's a helpful example. How can we own something that can outlive us? The land owns us. I thought that was very aptly put.
That is very, very beautiful. I like that idea. There is also an odd idea that was put in New Zealand, where they gave a river personhood. Basically, it became a citizen. Thus, because they found that they couldn't enforce environmental law because no one was being injured. And thus, when they created the river as a person, a registered citizen, thus that person was getting injured, and they could bring in environmental laws to protect it.
Yeah.
And because people could be taken to court. It was a really fascinating idea.
Yeah. Jen, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, sorry. I was just following up on your idea of, on your concept of ownership, and it's very interesting because I'm actually struggling with that particular word of ownership, because in Spanish, for example, we have the word dueñidad or dueño, which means someone who owns, which is how we would conceptualize, for example, patriarchy. And in English, I cannot find that, the equivalent of that, because, when you talk about ownership in English, it could mean something positive, but it could also mean that you own, private property and you're taking from others. So, but that brings me to something that, a reflection about the territory and how decolonization conceptualize not necessarily the land per se, but territory as a territory, history, memory, in which land is only a component of the territory, and which sees humans as integrated into the natural environment and embedded in time. So yeah, land as we understand in decoloniality is not just a component of that territory, but that is not fractured or divided by borders or by all the sorts of divisions that we now have, but it's an entity that evolves and transforms as time passes. So yeah, that's just a comment that I had on that on ownership.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
I'd like that.
Yeah.
In a similar regard, there can be problems around, let's say, rivers, particularly because rivers are a dynamic system. They move. They've always moved across our landscape throughout time. But the majority of, let's say, county boundaries or city or country boundaries or even boundaries between individual landowners are based on rivers. And thus, when the river moves, you get into a big problem around who now owns this piece of the meander because it's gone into another area, it's gone to another area. So it's a fascinating idea you're bringing up, Jenn.
Yeah.
I could maybe just add to that that like the idea of land ownership is a human imaginary. You know, it's a construct that really exists in how we conceive it in modern society as a result of colonialism and colonial capitalism, and that I feel that we can never actually own land as humans, that like we always are stewards, and whether we kind of fulfill that role or not, like that it's a responsibility given to us by the land, and whether we fulfill that role or not is up to us.
Jimmy, could I ask you a question around that? It just popped into my head. You said like there's no real ownership in nature, but could I ask then, let's say, about territorial animals? Because there's plenty of territorial animals, you know, that will contain an area and will own it for their lifetime, if you know what I'm getting at. Again, I'm stretching the analogy, but I kind of would like to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, again, I think it's a case of stewardship, you know. Like if we talk about wolves or something, like wolves are territorial, but wolves are also stewards. Like I don't think stewardship is limited to humans either. Like I think I was saying this to Mel before, but like even a volcano could be seen as being a steward. Like a steward is just someone that exercises some kind of responsibility in relationship building within land or as land. If that maybe sounds a bit abstract, but like what exists in the world is relationships, and whether we tend to those relationships or not is up to us really. Whereas I think other beings in the world haven't found ways to do what white culture has done, which is to abandon or to break those relationships.
Yeah, it's making me think of the and I have a feeling Jenn will have some nice insight into this as well as Jimmy, of the permaculture movement. And I know there's been some kind of questions around that of, you know, is that appropriated? Is it being used in the right way? Yeah, I'm just kind of throwing it out there. I don't really know. It's just Jimmy shared something on Instagram about it today, and I was reading, and I just think it's an interesting subject. So I'm wondering how that relates to the idea of decoloniality, and is it another westernized appropriation? Or is it, you know, I think in a lot of environmental groups, it's seen as a very positive move forward to have these kind of, just for anyone listening who doesn't know permaculture, like to have these integrated systems where you have many species working in one type of environment rather than just monoculture. So yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone wants to come in on that.
Well, I guess since it's the topic of my thesis, I might jump in. Permaculture was, for those who don't know what permaculture is, it was a concept created in Australia by Bill Mollison and David Homren in the 70s in order to challenge the modern agriculture. Not only frameworks, but practices, right? The way in which food was produced at the expense of the natural environment. So that's kind of oversimplifying the concept, but more or less that's where it is. So I think it comes from where many positions come from currently. It comes from a good intention initially. from an understanding of nature. And the issue, I would say, and that is, as you say, it's being questioned currently within the permaculture movement. It's not broadly questioned. It's been recently questioned in some sort of small communities within the permaculture movement. But what is being questioned is really all what we are having a conversation at the moment. Is it epistemic or knowledge expropriation or appropriation and cooptation? Is it really furthering any emancipation of people, or is it just benefiting, white people who are also living within settler colonial context, right? Because Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, South Africa, including many parts of Latin America, are settler colonies still, Hawaii, etc. So permaculture wasn't really questioning all those things and wasn't necessarily acknowledging indigenous knowledge to the extent that they should. I think what is important here is going back to that aspect of understanding land not as land but as territory. What I mean is not distancing ourselves from an understanding of land as, for example, as Ireland, or a connection to a particular plot of land, rather than thinking of the lands in which others live and have lived historically. So in simple terms, I would mean, it doesn't matter how much you are off the grid as an individual or as a family producing your own food in your back garden. If the only reason why you can do that is because the lands and historical spaces of others are still occupied and extracted from to uphold a system that benefits you, right? You're not dismantling anything by producing your food if you're not at the same time being active in challenging bigger structures of power. So yeah, even questioning just the simple, ownership in terms of owning private land, that's, I think, where it starts. And there are many ways that I think permaculture can incorporate in order to become a model that really does challenge those systems. At the moment, unfortunately, has been attracting a lot of the sort of the groups that have also historically sided with things as neo-Nazism and alt-right. So that is a very dangerous territory, right, to be in. But because permaculture has not distanced itself explicitly from those systems, then it's attracting all sorts of groups and individuals. So yeah, I would say it's a bit messed up, not messed up, but like I said, it's a bit confusing at the moment because permaculture, I think, can be a very positive force. But it has to disengage from certain aspects of colonialism. Yeah,
I hear you. Thank you for naming that so explicitly, and I think that's it. It needs to be explicitly named, especially when it's predominantly done or practiced by white people. Fiachra, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Mel. And actually, Jenn just more or less answered the question I was going to ask. Which is, what can we do to move away from these systems? How can I, as a consumer, as a native of Ireland, how can I try to make sure that my purchases and my activity, my behavior doesn't support these systems? I've been reading recently about farmed salmon and how it requires more kilos of wild fish to create the plump fillets of salmon that I like to eat, or I used to like to eat. We like to see them in the supermarket on a regular basis. But this wild fish is taken from West African waters, and it means then that the people in these countries don't have access to protein. So we're actually, our appetite in the developed world for luxury, I guess, or unnatural foods on a regular basis in uniform size with no bones. This appetite is driving hunger in other parts of the world. So I'm aware of that. I'm aware of land being deforested in Brazil, and I believe Mexico as well, to grow soybeans to feed cattle so we can eat beef burgers. Have you any recommendations, Jenn and Jimmy, for practical steps I can take or that the listeners can take?
And can I maybe just add in on that question as well, if it fits? It might just be an open-ended question about, is it even possible to do this while engaging with, say, the UN or the European Union? Like, do we need to totally disengage from these systems, or can we do it while also being in those systems as active citizens? Or do we need to even go against the idea of being a citizen of a nation? That's like adding in a whole worm can, but I'm interested to see what comes up. And Jenn has her hand there raised.
Yeah, this is really right on my alley, I guess. I've been talking about this for a long time, and those are really good questions, and those are the questions that you really expect. So the first question on what to do, it's the answer about this topics is always sort of in the same direction, right? The first one would be, supporting food sovereignty everywhere. Food sovereignty initiatives one way is by switching from supermarket processed foods to things that are locally grown, which means, yes, producing your own food, also supporting your local farmers market, and trying to make sure that, it's being produced locally and that is in season, and all those, excellent advices that we've heard a lot within the food systems movement. But there are also bigger things. So I think it's a both way direction. It's a engage and disengage. And so disengage, I would say the biggest thing you can do is corporate a permanent commitment to corporate boycotting. Obviously, we're at the moment using technology. We're using computers. We're using, sometimes I use social media. There are some corporations that we at the moment cannot disengage from because we need them to communicate. But we can disengage from many corporations, Coca-Cola, things that, Amazon, things like that, that you make a commitment, a permanent commitment towards that. There are other things that, could be join, volunteer, or work in different initiatives and movements in your own country or in, within the global north that aim for agendas linked to de-development of the global north, for degrowth, for a progressive tax on wealth, for a cap on wealth, for inheritance tax, for a universal basic income, for the opening of borders, demilitarization, for the elimination of nuclear and chemical weapons, for defunding the police and the army, support initiatives led by indigenous and racialized people on reparations, for example. There's this movement about paying the rent. I know in Ireland that doesn't necessarily apply, but you can also pay the rent in other, the diasporic Irish can pay rent towards indigenous within the US and Canada, for example. Educating yourself and, in decolonialization, in racism, actively boycott and reduce support of corporate power, avoiding engaging within financial justice. We urgently need the debt of the global south to be cancelled. Obviously helping to dismantle tax havens, and so there are many things that the people in the global north can do. And your question, Melanie, I would say that that's where this comes into place, right? Because that's not the approach of the development industry or the charity and philanthropy and intervention industries. The aim of those, and I call them industries because there's really a lot of profit driven from that. So the approach has been, a paternalizing approach of intervention and of seeing, the global south failing because there's a moral failing or that it hasn't been, it has to catch up with the global north. Mm-hmm. And that's not, I don't think that's not the approach that we should be supporting from a position of privilege. I think what we should be supporting is actually the opposite, an introspection on our own systems and trying to dismantle those. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful list. I'm going to type that list out so everyone can read it as well as hear it. Yeah, thank you. John, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, can I ask a question on that? Because I agree completely with what you said. I think 90% of what you said, I agree completely. But the question that always I find gets thrown at anyone who is in the anyway in the environmental realm is the fact of what of the disadvantaged people within our own society. Majority of what you have said there would not be possible for people who are living day to day, living paycheck to paycheck. So again, the question is, so that's kind of really the question that I wanted to bring up. Is this really only for people who are affluent within our society? What about people who are not? What can they do?
I would say it's for both, really. I think privilege and affluence, since it's a sector of the population which has driven most of the climate crisis and the social crisis. Really, there is a lot of responsibility, right? The more privilege you have, the more responsibility you have towards dismantling that privilege and those systems of power. But I would also say that a lot of the movements that have existed throughout history have been pushed by people who are understood as not having power. So, food sovereignty, for example, is mainly a movement of indigenous communities within contexts of poverty. Decoloniality, for example, has been created and expanded from those context as well. So I think it's not a matter of sort of having the same understanding or narratives about poverty. Poverty is created, it's a political system as well, it's not natural. And people who have lived in those contexts of oppression have been the ones who have proposed the most liberating and emancipatory frameworks, really. So I think everyone has a role to play, but obviously there's more responsibility the more affluent you are and the more you benefit from those systems, right?
Yeah, and I think building community resilience where we can hold each other, which is definitely the aim of the Green Step community, for us to be having these conversations, to be doing this work and supporting each other in doing that, I think is really key in what you're kind of naming there, John, like recognizing that there are people living on the poverty line here. And an interesting thread that came up in last week's episode was like, we need to reduce the cost of rent if people really want to be paying the proper money we need to be spending on our food. I thought that was really interesting. And I just want to head over to Jimmy, and we might start bringing this, wrapping this up. But Jimmy, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts there to add in.
Sure. I want to add maybe a little bit less practical of an answer, actually. And I just want to say that
we always love the esoteric.
So I just want to say, do what calls you, don't look for pre-packaged solutions or for moves to innocence, like ideas around reducing one's carbon footprint or the like. Look for ways to be otherwise in the world and work on reviving our relationship with all of life. Live in service to life. Go out and make the effort to learn Irish. Spend time listening. Look for ways to give back to the land. And also an acceptance and a recognition of the fact that this is intergenerational work and there's no way out of our predicament in one person's lifetime. People have struggled against colonialism now for 529 years and it isn't going to end in our lifetime. So, I think in Spanish, la lucha continua. The fight continues, the struggle continues. So,
yeah, thank you for naming that. And I'd love to just, I think this, it's an ongoing conversation. We will have our live events in May the 28th and June 4th for people to come and talk more about this together, like bring your questions. But in the meantime, I'd love to just ask, especially Jimmy and Jenn and Fiachra, if there's ways that people could reach out to you and get in touch with you if there's something you said that they want to learn more about, either email or social media things. We'd love to hear just how people can reach out to you to keep the conversation going. Right, pass over to Jimmy,
Yeah, so people can reach me on my email address, jimmy@talún.ie, that's TALUN.ie. My website is also that, talún.ie, and you can find the information about my project there. I run different classes and courses about basically the things I've spoken about here. So if you want to go to more depth on those things, you're more than welcome to come along.
Great. Jen, is there a way people can reach out to you if they feel called?
Yeah, sure. So my university email is jaramate@tcd.ie.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you very much. And you're both welcome to come to our live events and to be part of those discussions with a wider network. Fiachra, if anyone wants to learn more from you, can you let us know how they can reach out?
Sure. You can find my current project, Project Uisce, on projectuisce.com. So we'd love you to get involved in the marine protected areas campaign that's happening in Ireland at the moment to protect our marine biodiversity. And also you can reach out to me at fiachra.keogh@ucdconnect.ie.
Great stuff. Thank you very much.
Just what Fiachra said there, it's an incredibly important year for our marine environment in Ireland. We are creating, marine protected areas, and it's also the marine management plan of how Ireland will manage their marine resources for the next, I'd say 30, 40 years. This is kind of the first time there's ever been a strategic plan of use in our territorial waters. So it's incredibly important. Look into that. Definitely.
Thank you for naming that. Yeah. I'll include everybody's email or the websites and stuff in the description as well. We'll have an episodic kind of summary by the end of this week. And thank you all for being here. Is there any final comment or thing anyone would like to share before we close?
Gurv Mila Mahagat Mel, then Jimmy, August John.
Yeah, I'm mirroring that. Gurv Mila Buekas Live. Lots of gratitude to you all.
Thank you very much for having us and also for creating this space. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great chat, everybody.
Yeah.
And nice to meet you all.
Yeah, good team. We'll keep the chat going in the Green Step Facebook community, especially using Facebook for good while acknowledging its not so good functions. But that's the Green Step community on Facebook if anyone wants to join. And thank you very much for your listening ears and for being part of this. And if there's anything that has really tweaked your interest that you want to write to us about, you can reach out to thegreenstep3, the number 3, @gmail.com. And we really look forward to hearing you. That can be in poetry, song, video clip and audio, or written voicing of your passion. And the things that are relevant, we will be bringing to the Common Agricultural Policy. And the things that are not relevant in a policy context will go and flourish in another way. So thank you all very much. And Sinead, Gameake.
And as we rise from the ashes like the phoenix, we have another beautiful poem from Marion Horgan called The Scorched Earth. We'll catch you again next week. Thank you so much for being here. Gra agus Bianacht.
The Scorched Earth. As we grieve the burning forests and the scorched earth, we remember that fire too is an element which shakes us out of our complacency. It scorches the ground so that brand new growth is possible. A cleansing, a clearing, herald of a new dawn, seeds of life within death. Once more, the forest floor is more exposed to the sun. The seedlings, released by the fire, spread like fireworks, sprout and grow. Seeds of life within death. Our earth is resilient. The flames of the fire will abate, and a new cycle will begin. Seeds of life within death. Charred remains of trees, painful to our eyes, become habitats for insects and wildlife. Seeds of life within death. We grieve our forests as we would the loss of loved ones. But let us also realise that the fire creates space for new life, which, like the phoenix, shall rise from the wreckage. Seeds of life within death.